Welcome to the Reading for Wellbeing podcast. I'm your host, Professor Pozzulo. Today I'm talking with Dr. Sunita Sah, author of Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. Welcome, Dr. Sah. So great to talk with you today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Before we start talking about Defy, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what motivated you to write a book about challenging compliance?
Yes. Well, this book is really an accumulation of my life's work, both personal and professional. As a child, I was really known for being the obedient daughter and good student, which I went to school on time, did all my homework as expected. I even had my hair cut the way my parents wanted. And I remember when I was quite young, I asked my dad, "What does my name Sunita mean?" And he said in Sanskrit, Sunita means good. And what do we mean by good? Good often means, especially for girls, to be polite, to be nice, to obey, to not question an authority, to do as you're told, to do what's expected of you. And many of us have these messages, not just from parents, but from teachers and the community. And we start equating being good with being compliant and being bad with being defiant. And I was so fascinated by, even though I had a masterclass in compliance, I was fascinated by the people who could defy and how they could do it so much more easily than I could. And I wanted to study that in more depth. And actually, my first career was in medicine in the UK, really due to expectations and compliance. You know, you have the grades. Why would you not want to do medicine? So I ended up becoming a doctor, working as a doctor in the UK. And then I did some management consultancy work before I finally got to do a PhD in organizational behavior, really researching, first of all, sort of relationships between the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry and how they interact, how they influence each other, the rationalizations that we use as physicians, and why, when it trickles down to patients, we sometimes take obviously bad advice, things that are not good for us. And how can we resist that? How can we defy? How can we say no when it really matters? How can we speak up when it matters? Because when I delved into the research, I saw that one study found that 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, did not feel comfortable speaking up when they see a colleague or a physician making an error. And even if it's not a life and death situation like that, most of us often fall compliant and silent. And it creates this tension between what you think is the right thing to do versus what somebody else expects you to do. And that tension is what really drove my research, it drove my work, and ended up with this book, Defy.
Fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the stages of defiance? Because I think in your book you mentioned the different stages.
Yes, absolutely. So just to take a step back as to what do we mean by defiance, first of all, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the definition of defiance is challenging the power of another person boldly and openly. And I grew up in the UK, so I'm not one to normally challenge the Oxford English Dictionary. But in this case, I think this definition is too narrow and it doesn't honor our agency. And when I looked into sort of aspects of compliance and defiance, I realized that we've really misunderstood what it means to defy, and we need to think about it in a different way. So my definition of defiance is simply acting in accordance with our true values, especially when there is pressure to do otherwise. So you take something that's normally perceived as being sort of negative, rare, and risky, and transform it into something positive and even pro-social in ways. And that aspect of tension that I mentioned before, like we often feel this, like somebody expects us to do something, they expect us to comply. And if we think about what compliance is something that's externally imposed. So an order or a suggestion or even societal expectations is something that's coming from outside. And when we have that sort of expectation that somebody expects us to behave in this particular way versus what we think is the right thing to do, we often feel tension. That's the first stage of defiance. And I'm sure many of us have had that uncomfortable feeling, like this doesn't seem right. But we often just try to brush it away. We think the other person knows better, or everybody else is doing it, or it's not worth my doubt, it's not worth my anxiety. And we try and get rid of that tension, which is unfortunate because that tension is actually a strength. It's your warning sign that something could be wrong and that this might be the time to defy. So the second stage is really acknowledging the tension, just to yourself, like holding it up, like, what is this about? What value of mine is being compromised? And really trying to understand it. So we're not going for like a knee-jerk gut reaction. We're going to, I'm feeling tension. I wonder why. Why is this? What do I think is wrong with this situation? And then the third stage is really a critical stage in various ways, because the research shows if you can get to stage 3, you're more likely to get to the end stage 5. Why is that? Because this stage is simply vocalizing your attention to someone else or asking clarifying questions. So you're externalizing this aspect of defiance. And you can still be in a subservient position here. You could just simply say, I'm not comfortable with that. Or what do you mean by that? Have you considered this? Could you clarify a little more? I need to understand this. So you can still be in that subservient position, but you're also indicating you either need more information, more understanding, or that you're not comfortable, and to ask the other person to explain more. And this sort of vocalization of your steps in defiance, this vocalization of your tension or asking for clarification does a couple of things. So asking for clarification really raises the volume on the situation. And so other people might notice, if you're in a group meeting, they might have their own ideas. It's not whether the other person changes their mind or not. It's just that you've changed the water in which everybody else is swimming. You've changed the environment a little bit. So it has this ripple effect. And also now that you've put it out there, you're more likely to get to stage 5 because you can't go back and say, actually, I was fine with it. All seemed fine to me. So that's too much cognitive dissonance for us, as psychologists would say. So that you've now vocalized it, you're uncomfortable. What is it that's going to make you either feel comfortable with this, or are you going to proceed to stage 4, which is your threat of non-compliance? I can't go along with this. I can't do this unless we do an investigation first. Otherwise, I have to remove my name from the report, or you have to change the... There's many things you can do, but you're basically saying you can't comply under the present circumstances. And then if you can stick to that, stage 4, even if there's pressure, you can then get to stage 5, which is the final act of defiance. And the wonderful thing about stage 5 is that once you get there, that tension that you had in stage 1, it just dissipates. It melts away because you have now chosen an action that's in alignment with your values. And so you feel more authentic, more honest. There's more joy even that you are doing what you think is the right thing to do. Because if we don't get that, often that tension that's in the first stage that you try to suppress or you try to shove away, it comes back and it leads to all sorts of problems down the line. It doesn't dissipate completely. So getting to that act of defiance to be able to live in alignment with who you are and what you stand for and what your values are is the key to sort of reducing all that tension.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree with you more. In the book, you highlight how interpersonally, questioning can be challenging. You don't want to make a situation more awkward. We want to please the other person. And so in the moment, sometimes yes is easy. And you really, I think, articulate this very well in your book. Can you talk about if you are one of these people that just sort of naturally wants to get along, go along, and try to avoid those awkward situations. What can we do to, if it's feeling uncomfortable, do you have any strategies that we can use in those moments?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a number of different strategies. So one of the first ones is to really understand what's going on, right? So understand what compliance is and what defiance is, and what consent is actually, because it's fundamentally different from compliance, but we often conflate it. Let me just put that on hold. I can come back to it later, because one of the really good strategies is to understand this psychological concept that I call insinuation anxiety, that I've discovered in my research. And as soon as I discovered it and I talked to people about it, so many people say that they suffer from this. So you've probably heard of anxiety and know that there's different types of anxieties. So people might be familiar with, for example, performance anxiety. So if you're about to give a performance of some kind or a presentation, you have anxiety because you're worried about how other people are going to evaluate you. Insinuation anxiety is also concern and worry, but now the evaluation is going in the other direction. You're worried about sending a negative signal to someone else. You're worried about rejecting their order or suggestion or expectation because you don't want to insinuate in any way that they're doing the wrong thing, that they're incompetent, that they're inconsiderate, that they are biased or untrustworthy. There's so many of these negative evaluations that we don't want to give. So we don't say anything often when we should. We don't want to insinuate that somebody's sexist, for example, so we don't say anything. We don't want to insinuate that we don't trust our doctor or our boss or our manager. And so we often keep silent. And so just naming that feeling, insinuation anxiety, goes a long way. As psychotherapists say, name it to tame it. So once we know that's a really powerful force, it could be the reasons why nurses don't say anything when they see a physician making a mistake, because it's so difficult to insinuate that somebody can't be trusted or that they're incompetent or that they're making a mistake. So first of all, name it. And then second of all, don't slide into your sort of immediate, yes, that's okay. Just pause for a second and then ask yourself, what value of mine is being compromised in this situation? And what does a person like me, and we're now tapping into our aspirational selves, what does a person like me with these values, like integrity or benevolence or compassion, what does a person like me do in this type of situation? And just know that you have a choice in how you act, rather than it just being swept along and going along with what everybody wants, that you actually have a choice. So you have a lot more agency than you think you have, and you don't need to give it away.
Mm-hmm. I think that is so important for us to remember, that we have a choice and we should act on what is right for how we view ourselves and who we are, and to stay true to our values. There's so much I want to unpack here. I want to talk about the difference between consent and compliance. Let's go there. What is the difference?
So with compliance, as I said, it's something that's externally imposed. So an order, a suggestion, an expectation is something that's coming from the outside. Consent is very different. And I take actually the definition of informed consent in medicine, and I think it's really useful to apply it to other important decisions in our lives. So to have consent, or what I call a true yes, you need to have 5 elements. So first of all, capacity. You need the mental capacity to make a decision. So you're not under the influence of alcohol, drugs, you're not too sick. You have the mental capacity. Second of all, you need information. So you need accurate information about the decision you're going to make. But it's not enough just to have the information. You also need an understanding, a thorough understanding of that information, the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. And then the fourth element is the freedom to say no. Because if you don't have the freedom to say no, then it's merely compliance. It's not consent. And if you have those 4 elements, so the capacity, information, understanding, the freedom to say no, then the 5th element is your thoroughly considered authorization that comes from within, and it stems from your deeply held values. So that is consent. It's your true yes. You also need the same 5 elements for defiance, your true no. So it's not like a knee-jerk reaction of just saying no or being oppositional. You need all 5 elements to give a true yes and to give a true no.
Mm-hmm. Incredible. What really struck me was some of the real life examples you give in your book about times when it should have been a no and instead people gave a yes. Can you maybe share with our listeners an example, a real life example that really kind of resonated with you when you were writing the book?
So many of the examples resonated. To me right now, since we're talking, I was just looking at the news that the Uvalde school shooting trials are going on right now. And one of the stories in the book is I write about a mother in that situation who had just gone down to the school for graduation photographs with her young children, I think grade 4 and grade 6. And then she'd gone back to work on the farm. And then she got another frantic call as she just arrived there from her mother saying, there's a shooting at the school. And she just drove so fast to that school again, like, very narrow vision. I just have to get to the school. And when she got there, she just realized there were a lot of parents outside and a lot of police. And within minutes of arriving, her car was surrounded by lots of police. And she was told to move her car, that she couldn't park there. And she looked in and she heard lots of parents shouting, are you going to go in? Are you going to go in? And she said, is anyone going in there? My kids are going in there. And they just were telling her to move her car. And then she said, if nobody's going in there, I'm going to go in there. And they immediately put her in handcuffs. And she started pleading and everything, but nothing was really being taken into account until she calmed down. And then she kind of nodded. She said, I'm okay now. Take off the handcuffs. And they did. And immediately, as soon as the handcuffs were off, she sprang to the wired fence and she sprinted over it. She climbed up, sprinted over it, and she ran to her kids' room and banged on the doors to get them out. And she could hear gunshots in the distance. And at one point, she said that she fell down on one knee and she gave a little prayer and then she carried on. To me, is that sometimes it's easier for us to defy orders when it's for someone we love. I certainly, even though I grew up with what I say a masterclass in defiance, find it much easier to defy, question sort of medical treatments or question school policies if it's for my son than anyone else. And that's one aspect that we can really lean in. But I was so inspired, this story is one that many readers write to me about, that, of all the people there, she was this small, petite woman. And she managed to defy. But that's what happens for someone we love. We sprint for the fence and we go for it. And she saved her children. And she was intimidated afterwards for a while, but now recognized. And even though there are many reasons for her not to do this, she does speak up about the story and what she had to do to get her children out of there. So that to me was a particularly inspiring story.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful. And she saved lives that day because she was willing to defy. Can you talk a little bit about, hopefully no one has to experience that level of trauma, harm. In our everyday, do you have some of go-to strategies that we can use that maybe the stakes aren't that high, but they're more just things that we would encounter on a typical day?
Yes, absolutely. I talk very much about quiet defiance and small acts of defiance, which even if you have a self-concept of being a very compliant person, which I did, I really thought I'm a very compliant person, you will find ways that you defy and you're not thinking about it. So one of the reasons for mentioning that story, it's very inspiring, yes, but let's hope that we're never in that situation. But this aspect of really learning, well, what are the situations that I find it easier to define? Because you will find there are some contexts that it's easier for you to say no, and it's easier for you to maintain your boundaries and keep your agency than in others. And then think about what enables that. What factors disable my agency? And for many people, it's having to make a decision on the spot. So just taking a pause and a step back. If you can get physical space, that's always really good. That works really well for me. I tell a story early on about, when I was being pressured into signing on the dotted line with a financial advisor, and my beeper went off because I was in the hospital. That kind of saved me from that. But we can also just ask to have more time to think about things and step away. But some other small acts of defiance is really sort of starting to practice and think about the fact that we often think of defiance as being this kind of loud and dramatic aspect. There's these images, and certainly the story I told about the mother at Uvalde has that element to it. But that's really a myth of what defiance can be. Defiance takes many different forms, and it can be quite quiet. It can be just as simple as asking the question, what do you mean by that? When you're in a meeting at work and somebody's going to say something inappropriate, or this particular person is going to say something inappropriate. How do we know that? Because they've said something inappropriate at every other meeting that we've had. And so we can basically anticipate some of these situations. And this aspect of anticipating I know I'm going to be in this situation. And the last time I was in the situation, I didn't say anything. And I have regret from that. I have that tension still. I'm ruminating over what I wish I had said. That's what we take. And then we anticipate it. We visualize it. And then we start role scripting for those situations. Because that's the only thing, if we can get used to saying the words that we're not used to saying, and if we can get our ears used to hearing it, that is what is going to change the neural pathways. So if you've been socialized to be compliant, we need to train for defiance the same way we've been trained for compliance. And so role-playing that and practicing over and over again is what's important. And really remembering that defiance isn't a personality, it's a practice. And we can all do it. It's a skill set. We can choose to do it or not. We can be compliant one day and defiant the next. But all of us should have this skill. It's not just for the brave. It's not just for the extraordinary. It's actually here, available, and it's necessary for all of us.
Great advice and insight. Are you surprised by sort of in your research? Are you surprised by anything you've come across, or anything that you see that you say, oh, I wouldn't have expected that, or I really didn't see that?
Yeah, when I first started studying compliance, and I was looking at whether people take bad advice or not, and most of my experiments were done in the US and the UK. And they're two countries that really pride themselves on agency, independence, and autonomy. And yet, even in these experiments where it was obviously bad advice, so say somebody had to choose between option A and B, and option A is like so much more attractive that if you just give them the two options, like over 95% of people are going to choose option A. But if you just have a stranger come along and recommend they take B, there's no consequences for disagreeing at all in this situation. It's a stranger, you're never going to see them again. I found in certain conditions such high levels of compliance of 85% and over that people are just going along with it. And when I ask them why, they felt too uncomfortable to reject the advice because they don't trust the advice. It's not like they want to do this. They don't trust the advice. They even like the other person less, but they felt too uncomfortable to do it. Sometimes the reason is insinuation anxiety, but that aspect of social pressure is so high. And I was surprised that the results were so high that they're what psychologists call a ceiling effect. Right? There's people like, what about other countries? And well, in the US, we have a ceiling effect. So that's the country I expect that's going to say no. And I didn't find that at all, which was really surprising.
Mm-hmm. I thank you so much for that. I'm just conscious of time. So I'd like to ask you if there were 3 messages that you would like people to take away from your book, what would they be?
3 messages. So I would say, first of all, defiance is not a personality, it's a practice. So everyone can do it. Second of all, really think about how we've misunderstood what it is to defy, because sometimes it is bad to be good. So we sacrifice a lot when we disregard our values. And then the third one is, I've learned for many of us, the distance between who we are and what we actually do is enormous. And one of the main reasons is that we don't anticipate, we don't practice for those situations. And then we say, oh, that wasn't me. And so I have a defiance compass framework in the book as to how we can align our actions with our intentions and our behaviors and who we actually wish to be, our aspirational selves.
Mm-hmm. I love that last point, because I think so many of us, if you give us a hypothetical scenario, we would say, oh, we would never do that. We would never go along with that. And then if that hypothetical scenario happens, our behavior does not match what we thought we would have done. And it really is this tension, this push and pull, this, when we're in the moment, I don't think we're great predictors at how we will behave. And so I really love your point about practicing, role playing, thinking about it. I will give you the final word. What would you like to say about defying and compliance?
Yeah, just following on from what you said, like what I always say is that we're quite good at predicting whether we'll consent to something, but we're terrible at predicting whether we'll comply or not, because we underestimate all those factors in advice. And, I guess the final thing is, what I really hope with this research is to make defiance accessible for everyone, regardless of how you think of yourself and what your relationship with compliance and defiance is. There's something in there for everyone. And what I don't want is for people to say, oh, I wish I had done this, and not have the skill to do it. This book is there to give you the language around it and also the practical tools to be able to defy when you need to.
Thank you so much. Such an important book. Everybody should read it. It really is powerful, and we have the ability to defy. We have the ability to say no when we need to say no. The book is Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes by Dr. Sunita Sah. Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you very much.